Hello, good morning and good afternoon. I'm Elaine Buckberg from Harvard's Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's webinar, Leading the Charge: Best Practices for EV Programs in Cities. Today's event is co-sponsored by Harvard's Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability, the Harvard Kennedy School's Taubman Center for State and Local Government, and MIT's Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research. And today's session is part of a series of events that aims to share insights from early adopter cities in terms of EV charging with a broader set of cities in different places on their journey. Last summer, Salata, Taubman, and MIT CEPR hosted a roundtable of 8 of those early adopter cities. And at the roundtable, the cities shared their experiences, including their EV charging approaches, the challenges they had faced, and the successes they had achieved. We distilled these insights into a guide for city officials, their utility partners, charging companies, and building owners. The report's called Lessons from Leading EV Charging City. And if you want to grab a copy, a link is coming in the chat box. Our plan today is to start by asking a few questions to the panelists, or I'll start by asking a few questions to our panelists, and then we'll open up to audience questions. And if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, but in the Q&A box, please. And we'll try to get to as many as we can. So let me briefly introduce today's panelists. But before I do so, I want to tell everyone that today's webinar is being recorded. We're doing that so we can share it with a yet broader set of cities with officials who might not be able to watch it right now. So our panelists, first we're joined by Sue Baldwin of Denver. She's the Electrified Mobility Administrator for the City of Denver in their Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency Department. Previously, she was the Interim Executive Director of Denver Bike Sharing and the Director of the Marketing and Community Partnerships at Denver B-Cycle, a nonprofit that operates the citywide bike share program. And Sue has reported some network challenges today, so it's possible we'll lose her video at some point in order to make sure we can at least hear from her. Will Carey is the Assistant Commissioner for Policy at New York City's Department of Transportation. At DOT, he works on a broad range of policy issues, including electric vehicle charging, micromobility, accessibility, automated vehicles, Vision Zero, congestion pricing, which just went into effect, and innovation. Kristen Hull joins us from Portland, where she is the Planning and Project Development Division Leader for Portland's Department of Transportation. Kristen leads a team of more than 30 transportation professionals responsible for transportation policy, long-range and project planning, project development, and development of new mobility and electrification programs. So welcome and thank you to Sue, Will, and Kristen, and let's get started with some questions. So first, there are a lot of different ways that cities have structured their EV charging program. So first, let's get a sense of the breadth we have here. What's your city's model and how did you decide on the strategy? And let's start with you, Sue.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining this and thanks for organizing, Elaine and team. So we're the climate office within the city of Denver. So we're a little bit of a specialized agency that's 100% focused on climate solutions and 6 allowable uses, of which mobility is one of them. So on EV charging, we have sort of 2 parallel paths that run together. One is on the program side, where we really focus on market transformation, incentivizing residents to make behavior changes, whether that be on picking an e-bike, installing charging, multifamily, that's my area. I'm on the programs team. So really my focus is trying to figure out solutions and funding for multifamily housing properties to install level 1 and level 2 charging in the hopes that that will incentivize their residents, et cetera, to have a more broad adoption of EVs. The other side is we have a projects team that really does focus on off-street, non-right-of-way charging. So really focused on our city properties, rec centers, police stations, et cetera, that hopefully then also supports our in parallel path with our fleet transformation. And then the third, right-of-way, is really a different agency. That's our Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, and they focus on right-of-way charging. So we've got 3 agencies that are working on electrification within our cities, really focused on 3 different areas.
And Sue, in your intro, you hit on like all the reasons why cities have a particularly challenging are a particularly challenging setting for EV charging. That people are more likely to rent, to live in multifamily, and to park on the street. And you're really focused on all of that. So let's move next to Will. I'm going alphabetically by both last name and city name here. And we'll talk about New York City's approach.
Great. Thanks so much, Elaine, and thanks to the Salata Center and the Taubman Center for organizing this great event today. Just kind of wanted to highlight a couple key factors that, we've been looking at as we've been building our program over the last really 10 years now. The first is like a focus on piloting and flexibility. Since this was something that was entirely new for us, we took some, our initial approach wasn't to go sort of all in, but to test some curbside charging here, to build a fast charging station here, to kind of test the water and see what worked, and also testing different types of partnerships with the charging companies that we were looking for. We also have a very big focus on fleets. So high mileage fleets. There are a huge number of taxis, and for for hire, what we call for hire vehicles, what everybody else calls sort of Lyft and Uber. So how can we really get more of those vehicles to be electrified and provide the charging necessary to make that happen? And Elaine, as you were just mentioning, what are the unique challenges of high density cities? Neighborhoods with a high number of renters and a high number of folks who live in multifamily housing who rely to a great degree on parking on streets. So what are the charging solutions that we're going to need to get to those folks? And then we really also try to view our charging program within and as part of our overall focus on sustainable transportation. So how can we make this, integrate it with all the other things that we're doing, including around promoting safe and responsible use of electric micromobility? Where are there opportunities to use electrical connections to support more than one type of infrastructure? And where is it sometimes not appropriate to put charging infrastructure because there's so many other transit or other sustainable transportation options to get someplace? So, we're doing quite a bit of work on curbside, on fast charging, and on other ways to get charging out to New Yorkers. And happy to talk more. Thank you.
Great, great. And Kristen, tell us about Portland's approach.
Portland has several approaches. One is to change multifamily code to make charging available on private property in more multifamily locations. But my work at the Bureau of Transportation is much more focused on how we leverage the public right-of-way for EV charging. And so for our public EV charging in the right-of-way model, we've chosen a permit-based model where we do not own, operate, or maintain the chargers, but we have a permit program that allows our private utilities, our publicly owned utilities, to own and operate chargers in our right-of-way under a lease agreement. This model limits the staff time to manage the program and ensures that the companies have permits in place to make sure the chargers are in good repair and up and ready for users. Our program also has some very specific locational criteria in putting chargers on local service streets in our designated centers and corridors. And that's a way to balance the need for proximity to multifamily housing and commercial with the other curb use needs of main streets. And we also have some equity criteria that I'll get into later around where we're allowed to install chargers.
Okay, that's great. Now, Kristen, you really started getting right into the partnerships when talking about utilities installing chargers in the right of way. So I do want to, one thing that really came out in our roundtable is that partnerships are a critical part to developing an EV charging network in cities, but that there are lots of different kinds of partnerships, both within cities and externally with private sector and community partners. So, Kristen, why don't we stay with you for a second? Have you formed any partnerships that have been key to Portland's success? And I mean, spoiler alert, I think you're going to talk about your utility, at least in part.
And we'll talk about the utility, but before I do that, I do want to recognize that an important partnership for us in launching this program has been our partnership with the Department of Energy, because we do have a grant program that is allowing us to install our first round of chargers and really pilot this program and make it work. So without that federal program, we would have been much slower to start. But beyond that, utilities have been a really key partner because they will be the owners and operators of those facilities, and we have had to work together to figure out a permit program that both protects the city's interests as a right-of-way manager and allows utilities to have a program that will work and be cost-effective and hopefully economically viable for them. The DOE grant will allow us to install 42 pole-mounted chargers in partnership with our 2 publicly owned utilities. But beyond that, we'll be hoping we figure out a model that makes this something utilities want to do on their own. We've also found that those internal partnerships within the city have been important. We've needed to navigate lots of demands on the right of way that any of you who are from city DOTs understand, everything from bike racks to street trees to bioswales, want the same space. And so figuring out how to manage that in the space has been important. And then with our internal folks who actually issue the permits, making sure we have a system that they feel like they can manage has been really important. So partnerships, all the way from the very closest partnerships within the Bureau to other parts of the city, to utilities and public stakeholders.
Great. Well, what partnerships have been particularly important in New York City?
Yeah, gonna hit a lot of the same points that Kristen hit on. Con Edison, our local utility, is our most important partner, and they wear sort of 2 hats at the same time. On the one hand, they're a funder because we get incentive funding for our projects through them, and then on the other hand, they're also obviously the electricity provider, and so we need to work with them to get hookups for our projects. We're lucky in that they have a large and growing e-mobility team, and have been very sort of pro EV charging, and in fact funded our first pilot program on curbside. So they're very important. The other is our other funders, so the state and the federal government. We got a $15 million charging and fueling infrastructure grant to expand our curbside program, which is great. And there's a New York State Energy Research Development Authority, which is also providing us with funding. And then the companies and the startups in this space have also been very, very helpful. And we've engaged with them both formally through requests for information and industry days to learn more about their business models, what they're looking for, how they structure their services. And that's been important for us to learn. And also just informally, there's so many new companies, new startups popping up, just having an ear out there to hear about new infrastructure models and new service models has been very useful.
Great. So what about you? Talk about some of Denver's key partnerships.
So we're a little bit different in that we are a fully funded tax-based agency. So we're a little less reliant on having to form these partnerships in order to move our programs forward. Obviously, we work really closely with Xcel Energy, our utility partner, on installs and permits and that those part for our charging. We're funding those ourselves, and so we have less. Obviously we have partnerships with those different agencies that we need to install those chargers on. But for the most part, we can operate fairly independently without relying on outside partners to move our projects forward.
And, do you want to touch for a second on internal partnerships within city government? That's a really important thing that came out in our
Yeah,
discussion.
it's an interesting challenge. I mean, I'm sure everybody knows that, like, with fleet transformation, for example, our mayor has really put a high priority on transforming, the first responders fleets. And it's a huge cultural shift to get them to move in that direction. So you have to do those things in a parallel, right? You've got to have the chargers on site at the police station so that they see that, there's an opportunity, they see how easy it is for them to have charging on site and to change to a pursuit rated EV. So we actually started with e-bikes. That was our first step, was to sort of get in the culture shift on that, was to get to buy all of the district's e-bikes so that they could see how, an electric and I mean, it's not an electric vehicle, but it's an electric vehicle could start that cultural transformation, and how they could utilize those tools to get deeper into their communities, et cetera. So we have to work with all of them to move those things forward.
And you really raised an interesting point that I don't think many people know. So I used to be chief economist of General Motors, and something one of my teams did a big study on was the use case for police pursuit vehicles being EVs. And it's a fantastic use case because, one, they typically do about 100 miles a day, and two, the acceleration on EVs is incredible. So it's you don't need that special engine even.
No. And so now we're trying, we've been working with the fleet team. So now we're actually going up the food chain, and, because we've made that first step with e-bikes, and we had a champion sort of within the higher levels within the police department. Hopefully now we can get them to champion it from the inside, so that you really do have that top down, bottom up approach, and that, right, charging is going along with it, that we are looking to pay for these for fast charging to be on site, so that you never have to think about how that's going to work.
Great. So, Will, I want to come back to you now. Tell us about how New York City selects charging locations.
Sure. We have a kind of two major thrusts right now. One is our curbside program, and one is our fast charging program. I'll start by talking a little bit about curbside. We started by doing a partnership with Con Edison, our local utility, where we installed 100 charge points across the city. And in that case, we were looking to test a lot of different neighborhood typologies, and to go to places where we had local political support to put those in. That program has been really, really successful. And one of the things we saw that was a little bit interesting was, like, we not only got good utilization in places that had higher incomes, where we might expect to see higher EV adoption, we also got it in more moderate income neighborhoods. In fact, one of the most highly used chargers in this system is in Jackson Heights in Queens, a more middle income neighborhood where a lot of taxi and FHV drivers use. And there's a charger there that has over 95% utilization. So when we're thinking about doing our expansion, we're now going to be going to a system of 600 or more curbside chargers across the city. We'll be the owner operator. We're focusing on a real mix of those types of neighborhoods with a high proportion of multifamily housing, particularly older multifamily housing that doesn't have accessory parking. We're looking at places that have a high percentage of taxi and FHV drivers, because a lot of those folks park their vehicles on the street when they're not working. And pursuant to the federal requirements of our grant, we're also doing a focus on lower and moderate income neighborhoods. And we think that's important because it's not, obviously it's great to have chargers that have high utilization, but there's also a component here of wanting to make sure that anyone in any neighborhood has the ability to adopt an EV and to find a place to charge. That's the sort of the story on our curbside program. When it comes to fast charging, there are a number of private players that are making investments in the 5 boroughs of New York, and what we're finding is a lot of them want to be in Manhattan, or they want to be in the inner ring. If you know the geography of New York City, they want to be in the inner ring of Brooklyn and Queens, again, where there are higher incomes and potentially more demand. And that's great. Like, we want the private entities to make those investments. What we want to do is then look at that map and then fill those gaps. So where is there property that the city owns in terms of parking lots that we own at parks, DOT, we own several parking lots. And how can we use that to fill the gaps to make sure there's equitable access to fast charging across New York City? And that's what we're doing. And we have a target that all New Yorkers are going to live within 2.5 miles, which is roughly a 10 to 15-minute drive in New York City terms, from a fast charging station by 2030. And we have 3 sites that are up and running, and we have about another 15 that are online. And these are not necessarily like, your 20 fast charger mega stations. A lot of them, it's just like, can we get 4? Can we get 6 fast chargers into this site and create more of a neighborhood hub? And just the final thing I'll mention is we're also overlaying on top of this network of chargers, both fast and level 2, what our electric micromobility needs are. So can we co-locate? We have City Bike, which is our big bike sharing system. Can we co-locate? And they have a big shared e-bike program. Can we co-locate stations there? Can we have battery swapping stations for e-bike users at some other locations? And trying to look at all of that together.
Great. And something that is embedded in your comments is the idea that as the EV market gets more mature, there are going to be more EVs that enter the used market. And as
Yeah.
used EVs, they become more accessible to, EVs become accessible to people at a wider range of income. And you're preparing for that. So what do you see as Denver's biggest opportunity with EV charging in 2025? And where do you see your program going this year?
So one of our big focuses, so we, again, as I said, we are very fortunate in that we've got tax funding. So we've got a pool of money that we can put towards this. Last year, luckily our focus is trying to help pay for and install multifamily EV charging in as wide of an area as possible, really focused on that level 1 and maybe non-networked level 2, really to say, like, we're not trying to install DC fast charging everywhere. Like, if you're going to we want to make sure that if you are thinking about buying an EV, you know that you have a plug that you can utilize at your location. So really that's our focus for 2025, is really trying to expand that multifamily charging level and
We're losing
pay
you a
for
little.
it.
You want to go
And
camera off
so
for a
it's,
second?
we talk a lot about yeah. There
Roll
we go.
back that last
So
sentence.
again, we talk a lot about, sorry, did you miss that other part?
Roll
Okay.
back that last sentence, please.
Oh, so our goal is to try to get as much lower level charging infrastructure at multifamily housing properties as possible, and then we'll fund it. So it's a little bit, again, a parallel path where it's education to say that you don't necessarily need to have fast charging in every single location. Most multifamily properties don't want to pay network fees. And that actually, in addition, like, we'll pay for it, but it also really works and is a good amenity for your residents.
Great. Thank you. So Kristen, coming back to you, what advice, a big thing that we closed our roundtable with back in the summer was, what advice do you have for other cities, and what do you wish you knew then that you know now? So what's your advice for cities just beginning their journeys based on Portland's experience?
So I solicited some input from my staff who are closer to the program delivery, but from my perspective as a leader in our organization, to really understand this as a change management exercise, that the stakeholders engaged, that our internal stakeholders are all navigating a changing environment, and that can feel pretty scary when we're asking to do something in our right of way we haven't done before. We have a lot of folks who are very comfortable with right of way uses that we've had established in the past, and so just going slow with those folks, centering on our values and the why we're doing this, building an understanding, doing a lot of listening about the programs we have in place already. So we're not reinventing the wheel, but using those things we have already, and then adapting them to this new need, looking for those areas where we do need new programs and then kind of treading carefully through those. But really understanding this is change, and change is slow, and best entered with a great amount of humbleness and learning from those who have more expertise than you do. And that goes for both our internal partners and our external partners. So we also really talking to your utilities or your other providers early and often, understanding what their constraints are, what their needs are, understanding the business models and sharing that out. I think we started with some, in our broader political context, some misconceptions about the economics of publicly provided EV charging, and how we could both meet equity goals and have an economically viable program, and had to really ask ourselves the why. And so I think that my big advice is to realize that this, like anything else we do, is change. And change is best done when centered on a key set of values that are deeply held within your organization, and keeping those at the forefront of the work you're doing.
So I want to ask one more question before we start going to audience questions, and I really want to urge the audience to put your questions in the Q&A box, so we can start to take your questions. But you were just touching on some of the issues around equity. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how you thought about that?
I would love to. This is one of the things that I feel just most passionately about in our program. When we entered into this program, we knew that, and we'd done some mapping of available public EV charging in the city, and we saw that there were some real patterns where some residents had really great access to public EV charging, or primarily lived in single family owner occupied units with access to a driveway and a garage. And so when my family bought an EV, we were able to install a charger in our garage and our driveway and charge our car there. And that is a super inexpensive way to charge your vehicle, made it very easy. And we looked at the patterns in our community. We saw that we had a central core that had a lot of those conditions, either charging at home or publicly available charging. We saw a big part of our community that we wanted to have access to the benefits of electrification, and also our folks who may have fewer choices around taking transit or biking or walking to work or their daily services every day because of the length of their commutes. And those folks didn't have access to charging. And so when we started thinking about how can we both create a system that is economic and attracts folks who want to use it, but also centers those equity concerns, we started thinking about how we do a twofer. So we, in our program, are allowing our utilities to put chargers in the areas that they consider maybe most likely to be highly utilized right away. But in exchange for doing that, are also being asked to put chargers in an area that don't already have charging capacity. So that's been the way we balance that out. And we are using our U.S. Department of Energy Park and Charge grant to really supercharge the ability to get chargers in those areas that are not served by the private market already.
Will, was there something you wanted to add to that?
No, I think Kristen was just highlighting a really effective strategy that we're going to try to use here as well, which is, we have sites for fast charging hubs that are in neighborhoods where we have a very good sense that the private market wants to be, and to use, providing access to those sites to create stations, and linking that to investment in stations in other neighborhoods, more low and moderate income neighborhoods, farther from the Manhattan core. Combining those opportunities together is a great way to stimulate investment on a more equitable basis.
And I see Sue wants to jump in. So Sue, tell us.
Yeah, I would add to that too. We're just launching into a mobility hub study with our policy team as well as our charging team to look at some of those same things, like how do we craft these fast charging plazas in all neighborhoods in Denver. So we'll have more information in the next year as well after we learn a little bit more about how we craft those together.
Great. So let's get into some of the audience questions. So we have a question about the use of renewable energy. So to what extent and how are the cities thinking about maximizing the use of renewable energy in the charging stations in your cities?
I can take that one, or start with that one. It's a real challenge in New York City. We are a lot of our power plant infrastructure is natural gas. And so we have to find new ways to bring renewable energy, not only to power the electrification of transportation, but also to power the electrification of all our building heating systems and other things that create GHG emissions in New York. So we're doing a couple of big pushes. One is that we're making major investments in offshore wind, including creating staging areas and sort of reactivating dormant areas of our industrial waterfront to be staging for the installation of offshore wind, as well as working with our utility and with the state to try to bring in new transmission lines. Very difficult to do, to bring renewable hydropower from upstate New York and Canada to New York so we can increase our renewable share. One of the things we've also looked at is the potential to use solar to power EV charging. I think what we're finding is, certainly when it comes to fast charging, I guess I would say solar is great. We want more rooftop solar across New York. We think that can be part of the solution. On a site-by-site basis, particularly when you're dealing with small constrained sites, the amount of power that you're going to get is usually not adequate to actually, particularly when you're talking about a fast charging application.
So you're making parallel efforts both on the EV infrastructure side and on the renewable energy side. And the latter will ensure that higher and higher percentages over time of charging will be from renewable energy. So we've talked a bit about curbside charging in I think in all 3 cities. So we have a question about how you balance installing that infrastructure with losing parking, or is it losing parking? Is it dedicating some of that parking to EVs? How do you think about that, and how do you what's the discussion with your community? What do they think?
I can jump in on that one. In all the work, much of the work that my team does, we are balancing the need for roadway space with all the other things. So I feel like this is just another way that we're looking at that really important curb space and saying, what is the highest value use for that curb space? And for us, in looking at right-of-way charging, that has meant looking off of the main street. And we've done that for a couple of reasons. We've described it as around the corner location. So we're not on the main street where we're most likely to need that curb space for bike parking, for main street kinds of vehicular parking, for eventual conversions to bus lanes or bike lanes. We've said that's not where we want to install this long-lasting infrastructure. Instead, we're going to do around the corner where we're likely to have a little lighter pressure on the curb use and really probably longer term vehicle storage of some sort on those curb faces, rather than areas where we may be taking that curb space for mobility use, which according to our transportation policy, we have a modal hierarchy where we look at our space, how we're using our space, and vehicular storage on a main street is a lower priority. So we know that could transition over time. And so we've really addressed it by pushing the charging around the corner from those key commercial corridors.
Great. Well, how about New York City?
Yeah, so ditto, very, very intense competition for curb space and for curb uses, and it's a very political issue. Everyone has an opinion. A couple of things that we're trying to do is, we don't really view level 2 at the curb as taking parking away, because what we're trying to do is provide people the option to charge while they're parked. So that could be on, as Kristen was saying, on a spur right around the corner from a main commercial street. You can park and charge, pay the meter, go do your shopping, come back 3 hours later and have done a top-up charge. Or it can mean, this speaks to how you price. So like during the day, we want those level 2 chargers to turn over. We don't want people there for many, many hours past the time when they're fully charged. But we also recognize that overnight, someone's not going to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and move their car. So like we provide preferential pricing for someone who comes and parks at like 9 p.m. and then leaves at 7 or 8, because we want people to have that option to charge overnight. It also means that we're not, doing a huge amount of curbside fast charging, which is more sort of like a gas station model. We're looking more to put that in little off-street locations where people can come in, get their fast charging done, and leave.
Right, they drive to it. So here's an interesting question. What about have you made efforts working with the, private sector entities in your city, to make private chargers open to the public some of the time? So think about an employer that really only runs one shift, but it has chargers in its parking lot. Could they make that open in the evening, overnight, on the weekend? Have you tried, have any of you made any efforts towards that?
This is Denver. No, we have not. We've just really focused on trying to get as many chargers as possible on our properties that can be open to the public. But that's a great thought about inventorying, what's available and what's underutilized at certain times of the day, and trying to incentivize, partner with them to allow more public charging along the way.
In New
By
York,
the way, I know, go ahead.
In New York, there's not that much in terms of those resources. One of the things we have done is pass legislation requiring public parking garages and lots, like privately operated but publicly available, to install level 2 chargers.
Yeah. By the way, I am someone who owns 2 EVs, lives in a rented home. I do not park on the street, but I basically face the other challenges, and the closest charger to me is one that's unoccupied at night and on weekends, but is one that is only usable for the employees of that building. So it's a difference between a 5-minute walk and about a 15-minute walk. It's a really powerful idea. So, coming back to some other questions here. So is anyone game to take on a finance question? There's some questions here about using senior debt for curbside charging. Anyone game to take that on? It's a very early question. Yeah, I think we need to get some finance people.
I can't
Yeah.
necessarily talk about senior debt, but I can talk about financial models and the ones that we've
Right.
done. And I'll talk about this in the context of fast charging, where the city has real estate that has value, that we can trade for private investment. So we started off pre-pandemic in the 20 teens being owner operators. So we're paying for the construction, we're buying the chargers, we're paying someone to operate, and we're taking on all that financial risk. So once these stations go up, we're obviously charging money. But depending on the level of utilization, we're exposed to financial risk in terms of, are we covering our operating costs, let alone are we covering the cost of debt? As the market has heated up, one of the things that we will be doing now is we think that we may be able to finance, to stimulate the construction of these fast charging stations on our property simply by trading some value of the property itself. So, we won't charge you as much as you would need to pay on the private market to access the site. In exchange, the private partner will pay for all the investments in the utilities. They'll bring in the chargers, and they'll take on the operating costs. And then we might even be able to get some of the upside, if they hit certain utilization or revenue benchmarks. So we're going to sort of be testing that in the coming months to see, whether they're private partners who are willing to make investments on those terms.
Great. So we have a great question about maintenance. So how have your cities approached maintenance need? And I think that would apply both to chargers that are owned by the city and what kind of requirements you may have in place for third-party chargers, privately chargers owned by charging providers, but that you have contracted with in some form that enables you to set requirements. So Sue, you want to jump in first?
Yeah, we actually confronted that head on when we started. Our projects team started down the path of installing chargers, and we actually hired a third party that is our maintenance partner that is responsible for all the maintenance to ensure that they are up and running and regularly looked at, because we recognize that was an area we don't have the right. We're not the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, so we don't have that team that's what they do. So we basically took it on our own. So we've got a maintenance partner, an electrical partner out here that does all that for us.
Yeah, one of the lessons from the report, and I think that we've got a quote, says like plan and budget for maintenance. That if you
Yes.
don't have a plan for maintenance, if you don't have the budget, then you can actually be counterproductive because people see chargers but think they don't work.
Exactly. And
Chronically don't
our
work,
investment
which happens.
right.
in
Our
some
investment
cases.
is ill if they're not working.
Yeah. Kristen or
Yes.
Will, anything you want to add on your city's approaches to maintenance?
So even as a city has made the decision to not own and operate these chargers, that makes our partnerships and our agreements with those that are providing that charging really important, both in terms of making sure there are standards around uptime in enforcing those, and then having provisions for what we do if a charger becomes not used or not maintained, and how we get that removed, so we don't have infrastructure out there that is taking up space and not doing anyone any good, and probably creating a confusion in the public about whether or not they can rely on access to charging. So even this, how you operate and maintain, how you ensure uptime, I think is a key consideration, regardless of your operations model.
And how are you monitoring whether or not chargers are up to know whether to call the charging provider on it?
We're in the launch phase still, so we will require reporting, but I'll let Will respond because he actually does this already.
Go for it, Will.
I would just very much support what Kristen said in terms of making sure that if you're with a private partner, that you have well-defined standards in your contract and you have enforceable penalties if they're not meeting that. I think I'll put it this way, being an owner operator has been a learning experience for us. And we're going to be doing it again with our expansion of curbside, but it's something where, I encourage other cities just to think a lot about the resources that they will need, not only for regular maintenance, but for component replacement. This has been an issue for us. In our experience, the politicians love to give you some capital money to build the thing, but then the budget office doesn't want to give you any money to actually maintain it. And that those expense dollars to maintain it, including component replacement, because these things do break, is really important.
Right. So a couple things. So one, you've got to plan and budget for maintenance. Two, you need data to be able to tell where there are down chargers. And three, you need staff capacity that's going to monitor that data. Otherwise, you don't really know what's happening. Now, a big difference between the US charging market and the European one is cords on level 2 chargers. So we've actually been studying a number of the most advanced cities in Europe and across. In Oslo and in Amsterdam, essentially every level 2 charger doesn't have a cord and you bring your own, which by the way, you get with your car there, with your EV. And in London, it's about 75%. Here, virtually unheard of, but a new thing is these bring your own cord chargers. My understanding is that close to half the repairs to level 2 chargers relate to the cord or the plug. Any thoughts on that challenge?
Sorry, go ahead, Sue.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I don't know. I'd have to reach out to the maintenance company and find out what their report is, which I'm happy to follow up on with that if it's relevant to do so.
In New York, where there's just so much demand for sidewalk space, we love this solution. And we really wish it was more ingrained in the common practice here in the States. We actually did a pilot test where we worked with a couple American companies and a couple British companies to test these out, and it works really well. I think that part of the challenge here is that the NEVI, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Standards that were promulgated under the Biden administration, require you to have a cord and a plug. And we're very thankful for all the things that that have been done in the last 4 years to support our work. But this, I think, was unfortunately a missed opportunity to allow for the deployment of public charging where there's a user supplied cord model. Because right now you can't, a lot of these projects require subsidy, and you unfortunately can't use federal money.
Any of the bipartisan infrastructure law funds, I think is what you're saying, not just the next one.
CFI.
You're not going to have a bring your own cord fast charger. That would be dangerous.
Correct.
right.
For the level for level 2.
Yeah.
But we'd like to be able to just put a very simple pylon on the street with a plug and a QR code, rather than have a much larger installation that has to have a cord management system because we have to keep it off the street. And of course, you mentioned all the maintenance. It's still proving challenging for us to deploy because of the NEVI requirements.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a space to watch with experimentation.
Yeah, we're very interested in the bring your own cord model, and would love to see us head in that direction. I had the opportunity to travel to European cities this fall with several other American cities under one of our grant programs. And we were fascinated by this because for us, it's not just an operations and like traditional maintenance problem. It's actually a vandalism problem as well. And our public utility's been experimenting with some ways to have the cord, like very complicated engineering solutions to this problem, to have cords retract and be out of reach until you actually scan your credit card or you enter the app, those sorts of things. And this seems like a very simple solution to a complex problem. But there are adoption challenges to get us there. But I hope that this is a direction that we can explore further as a broader cohort.
So we have a question here that comes up often in discussions of EVs, which goes something like, oh, well, EVs are good, but what about cities trying to get cars off the road, both from a reduction of emissions greenhouse gas perspective and from a revamping of the city streetscape? How do you think about those challenges in your cities? Sue.
We're actually going through that as we speak. Actually, our mayor has selected climate as a real focus for 2025 on a variety of different levels, looking at district thermal and trip reduction. And it's interesting, like his first response to the how we reduce single occupants vehicle trips was just everybody get an EV. And I said, okay, that's not actually you can't just do that, right? To get us back to our climate goals, that to hit them by 2030, you'd have to get 200,000 EVs adopted in the city of Denver, which is not realistic. And so it's, we've tried to look at all the different levers that we can push. Obviously, EVs are a very important part of trip reduction, as is transit, as is e-bikes, as is walking. And so really trying to come up with the way we're looking at it is much more from an incentive and a Transportation Management Association model that, yep, we've got to have rebates. You know, there are rebates for EVs to get adoption, but we're also looking at can we, you know, we did some pilots last year on, can we pay you to ride your bike more? And it actually, we saw some great results on how you can get people out. Like it was a social experiment, turned into a really interesting social experiment. And I'm happy to share any of the reports if anybody's interested in looking at how they did this. As well as a trip reduction strategy. So we're looking at how do we potentially grow some of those programs to, you know, people are going to buy EVs. We're going to have the charging infrastructure support that, but we're going to go down a much more aggressive path to try to get people to take one less trip a week. Like, is that possible that Denver can get people to shift a trip a week?
Interesting. Well,
You know, a lot of same themes that Sue is touching on here. This is often presented as an or, that you either promote transit, walking, and biking, or you promote EVs. And, you know, there are 2 million, light duty vehicles in New York City. And yes, we want to reduce that number and get more and do everything that we can. And we are doing a lot to get people to walk, bike, and use transit. Even if we succeeded on getting a quarter of those people to give up their cars, we'd still have 1.5 million light duty vehicles in New York City. And there's just simply no way that we're going to hit net zero emissions by 2050 unless we convert as many of those vehicles as possible to zero emission. So for us, it's not an or, and certainly like understand where many of the advocates are coming from when they raise this. It's a good point to say we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past in, adapting our cities for another, automobile-based solution. But we think that we can do this smartly, putting these charging resources where they don't interfere with cycling and transit, and in such a way as to promote electrification as we also promote other modes of sustainable mobility.
great. So Kristen, do you still want to jump in, or we got a couple questions,
I
more
think
questions?
Will said exactly what I would have said.
Okay, great. So I'm going to try to hit a couple more questions here. So one is a great question about pricing. I don't think pricing comes up. So the question is specifically about what requirements you have around pricing transparency. And I don't know if everyone knows that the fact that gas stations have big signs with prices is just practice and not a requirement anywhere. How do you think about pricing transparency and pricing more generally, and let's keep these tight because there's one more question I want to get in.
For us, this is one of the reasons we
Go ahead.
This is one of the reasons we partner with our public utilities, because they are regulated by the state and how they can price the electricity they sell. So we have so that's one of the reasons we're working directly with our utilities, because it's the most economic model in terms of having charging be more comparable to what you pay to charge at home.
Yes, transparency, per kilowatt pricing only, and you don't have to be a member of their specific network. You can pay with a credit card at the machine.
I agree with Kristen and Will. So
Okay, great. And so I want to shift us out of, I want to see advice for, there's a request for cities to advise on rural charging. So imagine you're at a meeting where you're speaking not to a big city, but some smaller, more rural community. And there are rural, cities surrounded by more rural areas. So what would you say to them as to why they should implement EV charging infrastructure, potentially in an area where there's resistance to change? There's resistance to change everywhere, but resistance to EV.
I think when we think about our partnership with the Oregon Department of Transportation around charging, I think very much about my ability to influence the purchase behavior of folks who live in the city of Portland relies on having a robust network of chargers outside of the city of Portland. One of the key things we face in talking with folks who we would let about buying electric vehicles is the ability to take the family road trip, to drive to the Oregon coast, to drive to the mountain. And so for us, that provision of a network that does serve all trips is important to meeting our climate goals within the city. So there's an interrelationship. And I would talk to, I think our Department of Transportation has been very effective in talking to smaller, more rural communities where there may be fewer EV owners about the benefits of particularly EV fast charging in their communities, as it promotes people stopping in and buying services. I will tell you, when my family takes a trip, there are a couple of communities where we know there are reliable EV chargers, and that's where we stop for dinner. So I think we've been most effective as a state when they've talked about it as an economic development tool rather than something that's serving the local residents, although it clearly does both. And to have a successful system, it can't just be in our cities, it needs to be everywhere.
Okay, so I'm going to cram in one more question, which is, Will, you kind of raised you raised taxis and other, use your word here, but ride hailing services. What about car sharing services? That's often part of the car reduction. How do car sharing services and EVs and charging relate in your eyes?
It's an interesting question. Car share kind of had a moment. I feel like pre-pandemic, you had what was it? The system in Paris.
Car to go.
Yeah, your car to go. You had the system in Paris, I think Indianapolis. The LA was maybe doing subsidized car share in lower income neighborhoods. A lot of those companies didn't make it. There's a sort of a leaner group that's remaining in New York City, including obviously Zipcar. So, I think this does play a role in a city like New York. It's a little bit more just kind of an accessory on the side. We're in a more car and oriented city. It might be a more important strategy, particularly if you want to do subsidized car share for low and moderate income folks. But we do have a program where we work with car share companies. They can pull permits to deploy their cars on our streets, and we are having discussions with them as they consider electrifying to providing level 2 charging at those locations.
And I want to acknowledge that that's a challenging use case, because on one hand, it has immediate appeal as wanting to get more people the opportunity to try an EV, but you also want those cars to be able to be in sort of constant motion. And taking time to charge is an obstacle to that.
And you have to have enough critical mass. Like, I think to Will's point, when Car2Go was here in Denver, because of the way the city is laid out, I do think it was quite successful when they had the little smart cars, right? There was a lot of utilization of that. When they shifted to the other, the Mercedes cars where you couldn't find them, and it was it completely changed how it operated. We have a small operator here, and I think the real challenge is just how do you get some of these companies to have enough capital to buy enough cars, to have enough inventory. Like, we've done some pilots with them, and it works at some of those low income properties where it's available. But the challenge is, how do you get them to scale up and be large enough to where it's really effective? And I think I think I put this in the chat. We helped fund a technical readiness plan with them so that they could look at, other cities throughout the country and learn lessons and figure out how they could grow it. But yeah, so we're still working through that. I think that's the biggest challenge, is it's just not enough people. There's not enough.
Fantastic. And we are at time to wrap. So this has been a great discussion. I want to first thank Sue, Will, and Kristen for their honesty, for their candor, their thoughtfulness, and for making time to do this. Before we end, we are posting the slide should be coming up with the link to our guide for cities, the link to our upcoming panel at South by Southwest in March. So we hope you'll read the report. We also will be posting the recording of this webinar. So if you have colleagues who missed it, they can catch it after the fact. I want to thank the Harvard team at both Taubman and Salata who made this possible. Raphael Carbonell, Lila Alay, Tegan Flynn, Laura Hanrahan, and Jamel McMullen. This was a team effort. And I wish everyone a successful 2025, including on your EV charging journeys. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for your leadership on this. We just appreciate you guys continually forwarding the conversation and sharing city information. It's always incredible to connect with other folks than having a leader in that space. So thank you.
That's great. We plan to keep it up. Bye now.
Cheers.